Man will become better when you show him what he is like. Anton Chekhov. Last week, as I sat in the coffee shop, I couldn't help but eavesdrop on a conversation that was happening at the table beside mine. A conversation where two men, clearly space enthusiasts, were busy dissecting the utter smallness of humanity in this great, big universe. I am no space enthusiast, yet in that moment, perhaps due to the infectious enthusiasm of their voices, I found myself deeply, profoundly, inexorably engrossed in their dialogue, particularly when one of them started talking about the gradually increasing levels of bigness that make our own existence seem infinitesimally small. He went on, and in much more detail than I am about to convey, starting his rumblings with our modest Earth, revolving around the Sun, part of our solar system, and then ascended to the vast Milky Way, home to billions of solar systems, each with its own planets, moons, and suns. From there, he explored galaxy clusters, collections of dozens to thousands of galaxies bound by gravity, leading up to superclusters, which are clusters of galaxy clusters, and the cosmic web of dark matter culminating in the vast expanse of the observable universe. Being the history geek that I am, this random encounter made me ponder the great contrast. These men, emboldened by the freedom of their times, spoke with impunity about the vastness of space, whereas the pioneers of these discoveries risked their very lives to bring them to light. When Galileo attracted the unwanted attention of the Inquisition in 1633, more was at stake than issues in astronomy. By stating that the Earth revolved around the Sun rather than vice versa, Galileo was contradicting the literal truth of the Bible, such as the passage in which Joshua issued the successful command, "Sun, stand thou still." Worse, he was challenging a theory of the moral order of the universe. According to the theory developed in medieval times, the sphere of the moon divided the universe into an unchanging perfection in the heavens above and a corrupt degeneration in the earth below. Surrounding the moon were spheres for the inner planets, the sun, the outer planets, and the fixed stars, each cranked by a higher angel. And surrounding them all were the heavens, home to God. Contained within the sphere of the moon, and thus a little lower than the angels, were human souls. And then, in descending order, human bodies, animals, in the order of beasts, birds, fish, insects, then plants, minerals, the inanimate elements, 9 layers of devils, and finally, at the center of the earth, Lucifer in hell. The universe was thus arranged in a hierarchy, a great chain of being. The great chain was thick with moral implications. Our home, it was thought, lay at the center of the universe, reflecting the importance of our existence and behavior. People lived their lives in their proper station, king, duke, or peasant, and after death their souls rose to a higher place or sank to a lower one. Everyone had to be mindful that the human abode was a humble place in the scheme of things, and that they must look up to catch a glimpse of heavenly perfection. And in a world that seemed always to teeter on the brink of famine and barbarism, the great chain offered the comfort of knowing that the nature of things was orderly. If the planets wandered from their spheres, chaos would break out, because everything was connected in the cosmic order. As Alexander Pope wrote, "From nature's chain, whatever link you strike, 10th or 10,000th breaks the chain alike." Galileo published the revolutionary book titled Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems in 1632. The work was written as a fictional conversation among 3 characters, Salviati, who presents Galileo's views supporting the heliocentric model, Simplicio, who argues for the geocentric model and often represents the views of Aristotle and Ptolemy, and Sagredo, an intelligent layman who is initially neutral. The use of these characters allowed Galileo to discuss the two models, heliocentric and geocentric, in a conversational and accessible manner, while also providing a degree of separation from directly stating that the heliocentric model was correct, which he hoped might protect him from further persecution by the church. However, the character Simplicio was perceived by many, including the Pope, as a caricature of the old Aristotelian views, and possibly of the Pope himself, which led to significant backlash and eventually to Galileo's trial and condemnation. Apart from conveying revolutionary information on astrology, the book was revolutionary for its use of the Italian language rather than Latin. Galileo made his ideas accessible to a broader audience, not just the scholarly elite who could read Latin. This allowed educated lay people, including merchants, artisans, and members of the nobility who spoke Italian, to engage with and understand his scientific arguments. The people would decide for themselves what they preferred. Under the threat of torture, Galileo was forced to recant his heliocentric views and was found vehemently suspect of heresy. He was sentenced to house arrest, where he remained for the rest of his life until his death in 1642. Galileo and many like him were not spared for the crimes of being too far ahead of their times, for being breakers of tradition, and worst of all for putting humanity through the anxiety of having to face its own nature. This video does not aim to ridicule religion, nor to contest an institution that has comforted and defined meaning to millions across centuries. Such efforts are futile, and more importantly, irrelevant to our discussion. In many ways, what the church did to Galileo in robbing him of his freedom is not a religion problem, but rather a human problem. A human problem that I do not think is even intentional, but rather an understandable yet crucially inexcusable emotional response that arises from having strong beliefs, whether backed by evidence or not, completely crushed. More often than not, the crushers of these beliefs are usually scientists. When the heart and the kidney were first successfully transplanted, there were many who were annoyed at the idea. They felt that these doctors were essentially playing God. But what about the brain? What if we could transplant brains? Would it even make sense to refer to the procedure as a brain transplant? Wouldn't a body transplant be more accurate? As the philosopher Dan Dennett noted, this is the one transplant operation in which it would be better to be the donor than the recipient. And what of the brain itself? This organ, even without imagining its transplantation, is already incredibly mysterious. Neuroscientists Michael Gazzaniga and Roger Sperry showed that when surgeons cut the corpus callosum, the part of the brain joining the cerebral hemispheres, they literally cut the self in two, and that each hemisphere exercises free will without the other one's advice or consent. Even more disconcertingly, the left hemisphere constantly weaves a coherent but false account of the behavior chosen without its knowledge by the right. For example, if an experimenter flashes the command "walk" to the right hemisphere, by keeping it in the part of the visual field that only the right hemisphere can see, the person will comply with the request and begin to walk out of the room. But when the person, specifically the person's left hemisphere, is asked why he just got up, he will say in all sincerity, "To get a Coke," rather than "I don't really know. The urge just came over me," or "You've been testing me for years since I had the surgery, and sometimes you get me to do things, but I don't know exactly what you asked me to do." In other words, it will rationalize a falsity that makes sense rather than say what is actually happening, not because it's intentionally lying, but because it truly doesn't know, has no way of knowing, and has no reason to know the source of this error, which in this case is that the corpus callosum has been severed. Similarly, if the patient's left hemisphere is shown a chicken and his right hemisphere is shown a snowfall, and both hemispheres have to select a picture that goes with what they see, each using a different hand, the left hemisphere picks a claw, correctly, and the right picks a shovel, also correctly. But when the left hemisphere is asked why the whole person made those choices, it blithely says, "Oh, that's simple. The chicken claw goes with the chicken, and with the chicken comes the need for a shovel to clean the shed." Now, what does this incredibly spooky fact about the human brain tell us? It tells us that our behavior can be influenced by built-in, automatic processes that operate below the level of conscious awareness. Automatic processes that can be allocated to different parts of the brain, whether naturally or by force, as with our example of the surgically split corpus callosum. Even spookier is that these automatic processes, which are mechanistic in nature, are designed in such a way that they create coherent explanations for our behaviors, even when these explanations are inaccurate. It's kind of like a vehicle's dashboard telling you that a perfectly fine tire is flat rather than telling you the real explanation, which is that there is a faulty or obstructed tire pressure monitoring system sensor. Technically speaking, even though what the car is telling you isn't true, it isn't intentionally lying to you. It's just telling you a possible explanation to a problem in the only way it knows how. The similarities between identical twins separated at birth and reunited later in life are, for lack of a better word, spooky, like glitches in the Matrix, as if their lives were written from the same script, showing us the uncanny ability of DNA to program us, even if only to a certain extent. Instances where identical twins spent decades apart and took similar paths in life, like the Jim twins, marrying women with the same name, Linda, then divorcing and marrying women similarly named Betty, both naming their sons James Allen, both sharing the same exact favorite specific brand of beer and favorite specific brand of cigarette, both being heavy drinkers and heavy smokers, having the same woodworking hobby, both having served as deputies in separate sheriff departments and both driving the same make of car. Or twins, Barbara and Daphne, having troubled first marriages and miscarrying in the same year, followed by 2 boys and a girl in the same exact order, habitually pushing up their noses and having the same character-defining laugh. Oscar and Jack, who were raised apart, one growing up in Nazi Germany and the other as a Jew in Israel, both flushed the toilet before and after using it, wore rubber bands on their wrists, and read books from back to front. Or Paula and Elise, both of whom suffered from depression, studied film theory in college, and had similar tastes in music and literature. Mark Newman and Jerry Levy, who both wanted to be firemen as kids, became firemen as adults and chose a similar style of mustache. Beyond these day-to-day marvels, IQ tests reveal astonishing truths about the nature of identical twins. They show that identical twins who share 100% of their DNA are more similar than fraternal twins and regular siblings who only share about 50%. Fraternal twins and regular siblings are, in turn, more similar than adopted siblings of the same age who share no DNA. These IQ tests, like windows into the minds of these twins, show that, scientifically speaking, identical twins that were separated at birth are more similar not just in terms of how they look, but also in how they think about topics like religion, politics, and controversial topics like execution methods than fraternal twins who grew up together. Apart from the previous spooky examples I have given, there are also many other examples arguing for the existence of the innate mind, one of the oldest being language. Just as skin color, eye shape, and hair texture have been wrongfully used to justify divisions among humans in the past, so too has the diversity of language. But when we study these languages closely, we uncover that, though different across multiple cultures, languages can also be used to illuminate our shared commonality rooted in an innate mind. On the outside, languages, like human beings, are very different. But in his book Syntactic Structures, Noam Chomsky talks of the idea of universal grammar. The idea that all languages share the same basic backbone. All languages have verbs, objects, and pre- or postpositions, as opposed to having the countless other conceivable kinds of apparatus that could power a communication system. It is even more significant that unrelated languages build their phrases by assembling a head, such as a verb or preposition, and a complement, such as a noun phrase, and assigning a consistent order to the two. In other words, this structural similarity observed in all languages seems to suggest that our brains harbor an innate software or circuitry, a built-in capacity for language that enabled us to use the same rules to create language, even while separated by literal continents. The obvious differences that do exist in language and that make us unable to understand other people's languages are differences that, like the color of our skin, were only caused by geographical differences. If we were to compare languages to cars, it would be like appreciating the difference between a Porsche, a Lamborghini, and a Toyota. On the outside, they are different. They have different performance metrics, fuel efficiencies, safety features, interiors, technologies, and costs. But ultimately, they all have 4 wheels in a 2-axle configuration. This same line of reasoning can be applied to culture as well. Our cultures on the outside are highly variable, but aren't so on a deeper level. Cultures are, at their core, really just agreed ways of doing things, and humans throughout the world have followed the same seemingly innate rules in our brains to come to these agreed ways of doing things. One culture may, for example, punish a murderer by making him the object of their entertainment when they throw him into a pit of wild animals to fight to the death, while another may prescribe the electric chair. Furthermore, the severity of these punishments within these cultures may increase or decrease over time, but ultimately they are intended for the same thing: punishment for wrongdoers. This fact is especially appreciated when you consider that this is something that happened universally before different groups of humans had even met to form the global village that we know today. If the brain were truly a blank slate, utterly and completely prone to manipulation by its surroundings, and in other words, not in any degree innate, then this isn't the outcome we would surely expect. Another interesting fact that supports the brain's innateness is our ability to decipher intention. Imagine three subjects in an experiment: a highly advanced AI system, a chimpanzee, and a human child. Now suppose that the three were exposed to the activity of washing dishes to see if they would understand the intention behind washing dishes, which is, of course, to make them clean. When the psychologist Laura Petito tested chimpanzees for this trait of perceiving intention, she found that chimpanzees only mimic the act of washing dishes. This behavior may be driven by the chimp wanting to feel the pleasurable sensation of warm water running through its fingers rather than actually wanting to clean the dishes. This was evidenced by the fact that a dish was not necessarily any cleaner after the chimpanzee rubbed it with a sponge than before, and secondly, that if the same chimpanzee was given a spotless dish, he would wash it just as if it were dirty. This then leaves us with the remaining two test subjects, an extremely advanced AI and a child. In this case, both subjects would be able to decipher the intention behind the act, but with a crucial difference. The AI is trained while the child isn't. As we know, advanced AI systems today, like ChatGPT, are only as capable as they are because they have literally been fed terabytes of data that took decades to compile, enabling them to make the interpretations that they do, something that no human child has ever been put through. In other words, if the child and the AI were put on a level playing field by denying the AI information that has been accrued by humanity over centuries, we would find that children are clearly superior in their deciphering ability. This then leaves us with a question. What is it about the human mind that enables a child to do what an advanced AI cannot do without prior training? As scientists have proven via the evidence of activity in the brain during the gestation period, we can in the same light further ask, what is it about our human brain that allowed it to literally take part in its own development as we floated inside our mother's wombs? How did the brain know, without any prior experience, that it ought to take part in the activity of literally connecting itself to the eyes, to the ears, and to the skin, connections that, if they didn't exist, would leave us blind, deaf, and unable to feel? Some say that the answer to this is the soul, a soul that lives in the head and thus the brain, guiding us through the journey of life. But does it really? When the heart pumps blood and the kidney purifies it, returning clean blood to the body, we attribute these tasks fully to the mechanistic workings of their respective organs. However, when it comes to the brain, we disrespect it and underestimate it. We somehow tell ourselves that there must be an immortal soul, a ghost in the machine, an otherworldly presence that helps it in making moral decisions and that expels itself from the body once we die. Even those of us who don't believe in this spirit underestimate the brain, saying that all of its workings are inspired by its environment. This kind of reasoning suggests our capacity for violence is only because the brain is exposed to violence, and our capacity for kindness is only because our brain is exposed to kindness. The origin of greed, generosity, lust, self-control, fear, and bravery is reduced to being influences of our external surroundings, which can't have mechanistic or biological origins. Apart from the emotions I just listed, even mental conditions like autism, which we know today have internal biological origins within the brain, used to be blamed on external, cold, emotionally distant parents. The heart mechanistically pumps blood using the observable laws of physics and biology, mechanistic like a system of pumps and pipes following the laws of pressure, gravity, frictional forces, centrifugal forces, mechanical forces, and hydraulic forces. The same is thought for the functions of the kidney, the stomach, and the liver, but somehow not the brain. We tell ourselves that surely the love we feel for our children and the hate we feel for our oppressors can't be broken down to mechanistic workings like those found in an intricately designed watch or atoms, cells, and feedback mechanisms in electrical neurons. And so, it is to no one's surprise that ideas of the innate mind should meet with such hostility, as did Galileo's ideas in his time. The results of scientific experiments suggesting that DNA contains data that determines how we end up behaving, leading to the creation of an innate brain, have met with great opposition not just from religious sects, but from secular ones too. To say that we could, to any extent, be biologically programmed via DNA is to state, in other words, that we are not blank slates. We are not born clueless. We come into the world like computers with operating software already installed within us, innate knowledge within us. As I stated earlier, the innateness of the brain has had many detractors, not just in religious circles, but in scientific ones as well. Regardless of where this opposition comes from, it generally stems from the perceived moral quagmire of suggesting that the brain is innate. The most fervent opponents from the religious right reject the idea of the innate mind because it conflicts with their belief in the immortal soul and, consequently, the human moral goodness that, in their opinion, originates from this soul. On the opposite end of the spectrum, we have the scientific opponents of the innateness of the mind, who base their opposition on the atrocities of the past. One prominent example is the Nazis' perversion of biological theories, using ideas of genetic superiority to justify genocide, racial purification, and conquest. When one thus looks at these points against innateness from these two very different groups of people, one may conclude that the resistance to the idea of the innate mind stems not from a lack of evidence, but from the fear of the mass abandonment of morals that would arise from implying that we are, to any extent, like programmed machines. Even if you disagree with the views of these two groups, one has to admit that these concerns are valid. It is not enough, therefore, for geneticists to state scientifically that men may be more genetically inclined towards aggression compared to women. They must also show that this idea can be independently appreciated without making violent men across the world feel justified that their aggression is not their fault, but rather a result of thousands of years of evolution. Scientists must not only work hard to uncover new ways of understanding the mind, the brain, and genetics, but also to explain why it is acceptable to revise our long-held beliefs. This is the same problem that Galileo faced. Even though, scientifically speaking, he was right, he could not simply argue on empirical grounds that the division between a corrupt Earth and the unchanging heavens was falsified by sunspots, novas, and moons drifting across Jupiter. When trying to overturn a centuries-old belief system that governed morals in a civilization that distinguished angels from demons and that promised everlasting life, cold, hard evidence of sunspots was insufficient to garner support for Galileo. In the same way, geneticists today, talking about the innateness of the brain, must not only present the findings of their genetic tests, but must also navigate the turbulent waters of public opinion, lest they end up ostracized like the imprisoned Galileo. In the next section of this video, I will attempt, using ideas from the book The Blank Slate, to debunk the fears that loom over the suggestion of the innateness of the mind. And what are these fears? Steven Pinker, in his book, divides them into four main groups: the fear of inequality, the fear of imperfectability, the fear of determinism, and the fear of nihilism. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. The fear of inequality. The foundation of this fear is the notion that if people are innately different, oppression and discrimination would be justified. However, this line of reasoning is fundamentally flawed for several reasons. Firstly, if we find we are innately different, this does not mean that we should automatically default to discrimination. The problem is not with the possibility that people might differ from one another, which is a factual question that could turn out one way or the other. The problem is with the line of reasoning that says that if people do turn out to be innately different, then discrimination, oppression, or genocide would be okay after all. This line of reasoning takes into account innate differences while ignoring the innate universals that bind us together. Imagine, for instance, that someone possesses a genetic advantage, like Albert Einstein's high IQ or Usain Bolt's extraordinary athleticism. This does not mean that everybody else should maliciously be denied opportunities in intellectual or athletic pursuits, respectively. Despite our innate differences, we also share innate universals, like the desire to not be treated unfairly, to not be ridiculed, to not be enslaved, and to not be oppressed. The revulsion we feel toward discrimination and slavery springs from a deep-seated conviction that, however much people vary on some traits, they do not vary on these. Secondly, the notion that belief in the innate mind can sow dangerous divisions while the belief in the blank slate cannot is a fallacy. Numerous tyrants who orchestrated some of history's darkest atrocities upheld the idea of the blank slate. Just as the Nazis twisted genetic theories to justify their horrors, others have perverted the concept of the blank slate to sanction their own crimes against humanity. Consider the kulaks, the bourgeois peasants who were exterminated by Lenin and Stalin in the Soviet Union. Teachers, former landlords, and rich peasants faced humiliation, torture, and murder during China's Cultural Revolution. City dwellers and educated professionals were worked to death or executed under the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. Educated and entrepreneurial minorities who thrived in their adopted regions, such as the Indians in East Africa and Oceania, the Ibos in Nigeria, the Armenians in Turkey, the Chinese in Indonesia and Malaysia, and the Jews in almost every corner of the world were expelled or killed in pogroms because their success branded them as parasites and exploiters. Unlike the Nazis who justified their evil by saying people were genetically different, the examples I just gave used the completely opposite argument to justify their atrocities. They argued that we are all born the same, as blank slates, and therefore anyone who was ahead in life economically, academically, or in any other way must have been using unfair tactics like corruption and exploitation to get ahead. This, in turn, gave rise to totalitarian governments that forced everyone to be equal by enacting laws that, for example, did not allow individuals to own private land, run private businesses, or consume Western media. In other words, the very idea that we are all born equal can and was ironically used to justify discrimination, genocide, and oppression. This ironic truth reveals that ideas themselves are neither inherently good nor bad. It is our perceptions and misuse of these ideas that imbue them with moral value. If we were to eliminate every human idea that has been misused to justify atrocities, we would be left with a barren intellectual landscape. Many concepts, including religion, philology, linguistics, the germ theory, and evolution, have been exploited in this way. The science of the innate mind and genetics should not be unfairly condemned because the Nazis perverted it, nor should it be feared as a source of inequality. This principle applies equally to any other theory, including those of the blank slate. That is why, at the beginning of this video, I described the unjust imprisonment of Galileo not as a problem of religion, but as a problem of human nature. The irrational fear of inequality is so potent that even ideas as universally accepted today as the correlation between smoking and lung cancer were slow to be acknowledged by American health officials simply because the initial discoverers of this link were Nazi scientists. I could endlessly provide examples like these, but to maintain the focus of this video on genetics and the innate mind, the ultimate lesson against the fear of inequality is clear. It is misguided to argue that discrimination is wrong solely because people's traits are indistinguishable. We shouldn't ignore the reality of human differences, such as skin color, physical ability, and IQ. Instead, we should recognize that these differences do not justify discrimination. Whether we are talking about something as politically charged as a difference in skin color or something as innocuous as a difference in height, the principle remains the same. Oppressive discrimination is always morally repugnant, a blight on humanity's conscience, whether viewed through the lens of genetics, religion, economics, or any other perspective. Birth is painful, old age is painful, sickness is painful, death is painful. The first holy truth from Buddha's sermon at Benares, the fear of imperfectability. The second fear, the fear of imperfectability, hinges on the notion that if people are innately immoral, any hope of improving the human condition is doomed. This fear is illogical, resting on two fallacies. The first is the naturalistic fallacy, the idea that just because something is natural, it must be good. The second fallacy is derived from the converse of the naturalistic fallacy and is known as the moralistic fallacy, the idea that if a trait is moral, it must be found in nature. That is, not only does is imply ought, but ought implies is. The flaw in both the naturalistic and moralistic fallacies lies in the assumption that nature, including human nature, possesses only virtuous traits. No needless killings, no rapacity, no exploitation, or none at all, because the alternative is too dreadful to accept. This is why the naturalistic and moralistic fallacies are so often associated with the romanticized idea of the noble savage, the idea that the natives of the Americas, Africa, and later Oceania were inherently peaceful because they were surrounded by nature, as opposed to the evil colonist Europeans whose industries encouraged greed, violence, and cruelty. This idea of the noble savage, which stems from the idea of the blank slate, is possibly also what gave rise to characters like Pocahontas, the quintessential noble savage produced by Disney, a company whose founder expressed belief in the blank slate when he made comments like, "I think of a child's mind as a blank book. During the first years of his life, much will be written on the pages. The quality of that writing will affect his life profoundly." Using another cartoon, namely Arlo and Janice, the two fallacies can be humorously explained. In the cartoon, Janice mistakenly believes that humans killing for sport cannot be natural because of its inherent immorality. Arlo corrects her, pointing out that other species, like walruses, also engage in such behavior. Note that Arlo isn't implying that killing for sport isn't bad, but rather that things that happen naturally can be bad. In other words, we make a mistake when we automatically label something as good simply because it is natural and vice versa. As soon as we recognize that there is nothing morally commendable about the products of evolution, we can describe human psychology honestly without the fear that identifying a natural trait is the same as condoning it. This distinction allows us to address human behavior and psychology with clarity, free from the misconceptions of the naturalistic and moralistic fallacies. Beyond the abundant evidence from anthropologists debunking the noble savage myth and showing that indigenous people harbor the same capacity for bad traits and good traits as much as their Western counterparts, it is also perilous to base beliefs on unproven declarations driven by emotion because of the dangerous consequences that tend to follow. When someone bases their belief on something they can't prove, and then someone comes along and proves them wrong with cold hard evidence, people tend to react irrationally. In the early 2000s, anthropologists James Neel and Napoleon Chagnon found themselves in just such a situation. Other anthropologists, Terence Turner and Leslie Sponsel, who clung to the noble savage doctrine, turned Neel and Chagnon's lives into a living hell, spreading malicious rumors through their journalist ally, Patrick Tierney. These rumors damaged their reputations and careers, demonstrating how emotionally driven beliefs can lead to irrational and destructive behavior when challenged by evidence. They were baselessly accused of infecting the Yanomamo tribe with measles, when, in fact, they were administering vaccines. They were baselessly accused of soliciting sex from young girls of the same tribe, of withholding medical care from the Yanomamo people, and of fabricating data concerning the Yanomamo, specifically data regarding violence within the Yanomamo tribe. This, more than anything, incensed Turner and Sponsel. They detested the fact that people like Neel and Chagnon were exposing that there was no such thing as a noble savage. They hated that morally questionable facts about the social structure of the Yanomamo people were coming out. Facts like men who killed more enjoyed the benefit of having more wives, that the Yanomamo engaged in ruthless raiding and warfare on other villages, and that ritualized violence included chest-pounding duels and side-slapping contests. Turner, Sponsel, and Tierney acted as judge, jury, and executioner. The crime they found Neel and Chagnon guilty of was making observations that debunked the romanticized notion of the noble savage, and their punishment was the ruination of their reputations through a web of lies. Later on, most of the extremely damaging claims made against Neel and Chagnon had been excised, watered down, or attributed to Venezuelan journalists or untraceable informants. Furthermore, under extreme pressure from those who began to see through their deception, Turner and Sponsel admitted that their charge against Neel remained only an inference in the present state of their knowledge at the time. They had no smoking gun in the form of a written text or recorded speech by the people they were accusing. Even though they had luckily evaded a tragic fate akin to Galileo's, Neel and Chagnon had already gone through the harrowing ordeal of being publicly painted as monsters who exploited and massacred indigenous people. And why did this happen to them? It happened because they dared to show that indigenous people were just as human and just as capable of violence as anyone else. Turner and Sponsel had succumbed to the fear of imperfectability, so much so that they didn't see any objection to ruining the reputations of two innocent men if it meant upholding the imagined nobility of the noble savage. Another issue arising from the fear of imperfectability involves the resolution of conflict. Suppose that a naturally aggressive person physically assaults someone. Should they really be punished for their aggression? After all, it isn't their fault that they are aggressive, it's the fault of evolution, right? The answer is unequivocally no. Suppose that aggression is tied to a feature of human nature, such as that some people may have a stronger inclination to assert dominance or control in various situations. It is also a fundamental aspect of human nature that individuals desire safety and respect for their personal boundaries. It is inherent to our value system that the rights to safety and respect should not be overshadowed by others' aggressive inclinations, and that personal security is a basic right that outweighs others' impulses. So, aggressive behaviors that infringe on personal safety are not tolerated, regardless of any possible connection to natural inclinations toward aggression. In other words, just because something happens naturally doesn't mean it's good or should be tolerated. In the movie The African Queen, Katharine Hepburn says to Humphrey Bogart, "Nature, Mr. Allnut, is what we are put in this world to rise above." The existence of human nature is not a reactionary doctrine that dooms us to eternal oppression, violence, and greed. Of course, we should try to reduce harmful behavior, just as we try to reduce afflictions like hunger, disease, and the elements. But we fight those afflictions not by denying the pesky facts of nature, but by turning some of them against the others. For efforts at social change to be effective, they must identify the cognitive and moral resources that make some kinds of change possible. And for the efforts to be humane, they must acknowledge the universal pleasures and pains that make some kinds of change desirable. In conclusion, the ultimate lesson here is that it is a bad idea to say that violence and exploitation are wrong only because people are not naturally inclined to them. The genes ate my homework. The fear of determinism. This fear has to do with the belief that if people are products of biology, free will would be a myth, and we could no longer hold people responsible for their actions. In the traditional conception of a ghost in the machine, our bodies are viewed as vessels inhabited by a self or a soul that chooses the behavior to be executed by the body. These choices are not compelled by some prior physical event, like one billiard ball smacking into another and sending it into a corner pocket. The idea that our behavior is caused by the physiological activity of a genetically shaped brain would seem to refute the traditional view. It would make our behavior an automatic consequence of molecules in motion and leave no room for an uncaused behavior chooser. This idea causes, in many people, an existential anxiety that, deep down, we are not in control of our own choices. All our brooding and agonizing over the right thing to do is pointless, it would seem, because everything has already been preordained by the state of our brains. If one scrutinizes my statement, one might discern that the described situation is a kind of catch-22, an Ouroboros that eats its own tail. Agonizing over determinism is futile because if determinism were true, one's anxiety about it and even one's response to it would also be determined. In other words, existential dread over determinism is a fruitless endeavor, akin to an exercise in chasing shadows. The real fear of determinism that actually demands our time and requires analytical debunking is the fear that crime can be explained away via the misconception that an understanding of human nature seems to eat away at the notion of personal responsibility. This fear stems from the logic that we blame people for an evil act or bad decision only when they intended the consequences and could have chosen otherwise. We don't convict a hunter who shoots a friend he has mistaken for a deer, or the chauffeur who drove John F. Kennedy into the line of fire, because they could not foresee and did not intend the outcome of their actions. We show mercy to the victim of torture who betrays a comrade, to the delirious patient who lashes out at a nurse, or to the madman who strikes someone he believes to be a ferocious animal, because we feel they are not in command of their faculties. We don't put a small child on trial if he causes a death, nor do we try an animal or an inanimate object because we believe them to be constitutionally incapable of making an informed choice. If we assert that the mind is innate, it implies that more people would be deemed blameless, with the innateness of their minds taking the blame. Looking back through history, we amusingly find curious examples of people who had no qualms punishing the soulless, like the Hebrew rule of stoning an ox to death if it killed a man, the Athenian practice of putting an axe on trial if it injured a man and hurling it over the city wall if found guilty. The medieval French case in which a sow was sentenced to be mangled for having mauled a child, and the whipping and burial of a church bell in 1685 for having assisted French heretics. Today, of course, examples like these are absurd, even silly. No rational person today would suggest jailing an axe for killing a man, and this is precisely where the problem arises for the idea of the innate mind. If the mind, like an axe, is a mechanical tool, purpose-built rather than malleable, shouldn't it also be excused for killing a man? Some criminal lawyers clearly think so when they say that the actions of their clients may not have been a product of total free will because they were found to possess a rare gene that predisposed them to violent outbursts. On this basis, a lot of people try to solve this moral conundrum by invoking the free will that arises from the ghost in the machine, the spirit, or the immortal soul. But this too has a problem. If behavior were chosen by an utterly free soul, then we really couldn't hold people responsible for their actions. The soul would not be deterred by the threat of punishment, or be ashamed by the prospect of opprobrium, or even feel the twinge of guilt that might inhibit a sinful temptation in the future, because it could always choose to defy those causes of behavior. We could not hope to reduce evil acts by enacting moral and legal codes, because a free soul, floating in a different plane from the arrows of cause and effect, would be unaffected by the codes. Morality and law would be pointless. We could punish a wrongdoer, but it would be out of sheer spite, because it could have no predictable effect on the future behavior of the wrongdoer or of other people aware of the punishment. On the other hand, if the soul is predictably swayed by the allure of esteem and shame, or reward and punishment, it is no longer truly free because it is compelled, at least probabilistically, to respect those contingencies. In other words, if the community would think you're a boorish cad for doing X, don't do X, can be programmed into an algorithm and implemented in neural hardware, meaning that the idea of a soul or a ghost in the machine would be superfluous and redundant. Here's another thing to consider. Even if we favored ideas of the blank slate over those of the innate mind, similar problems of the scapegoats still arise. It's not his fault, it's just that he was abused as a child. It's not his fault, it's just that his behavior was affected by his large consumption of Twinkies. It's not his fault, it's just that he comes from a minority group that has been oppressed for decades in this country. It's not his fault his mind was poisoned by adult film. It's not his fault, it's the destructive rock music that he's been exposed to. One of the most famous examples of this is when Hillary Clinton talked about her husband's infidelity being a result of trauma he experienced as a 4-year-old, stemming from his mother and grandmother having disagreements. This, in essence, demonstrates that the fear of determinism, or more precisely, the fear that punishment can be explained away, isn't truly a problem that stems from the idea of the innate mind, since it still surfaces if you believe in the blank slate. So, what then causes this issue to arise? It is a confusion of explanation with exculpation. For instance, considering the Hillary Clinton example, people mistake her explanation of her husband's behavior for her condoning it. Just because bad behavior can be explained doesn't mean it must be condoned. If behavior isn't utterly random, it will inevitably have some explanation. If behavior were utterly random, we couldn't hold the person responsible in any case. So, if we ever hold people responsible for their behavior, it will have to be in defiance of any causal explanation we feel is warranted, whether it invokes genes, brains, evolution, media images, self-doubt, or apparently, in the case of Bill Clinton, being raised by 2 bickering women. The difference between explaining behavior and excusing it is captured in the saying, "To understand is not to forgive," and has been stressed in different ways by many philosophers, including Hume, Kant, and Sartre. Most philosophers believe that unless a person was literally coerced, that is, someone held a gun to his head, we should consider his actions to have been freely chosen, even if they were caused by events inside his skull. In other words, it is a bad idea to say that people are responsible for their actions only because the causes of those actions are mysterious. 2 things fill the mind with ever new and increasing admiration and awe, the oftener and more steadily we reflect on them: the starry heavens above and the moral law within. Immanuel Kant, Critique of Practical Reason. The fear of nihilism. The 4th and final fear is the fear of nihilism, the belief that if people are products of biology, life would have no higher meaning and purpose. In 1996, Pope John Paul II agreed that the theory of evolution is more than just a hypothesis, but he drew the line at the spiritual soul. He went on to say that it is by virtue of his spiritual soul that the whole person possesses such a dignity even in his body. If the human body take its origin from pre-existent living matter, the spiritual soul is immediately created by God. Consequently, theories of evolution, which in accordance with the philosophies inspiring them, consider the spirit as emerging from the forces of living matter or as a mere epiphenomenon of this matter, are incompatible with the truth about man, nor are they able to ground the dignity of the person. In other words, if scientists are right that the mind emerged from living matter, we would have to give up the value and dignity of the individual, solidarity and selflessness with regard to our fellow humans, and the higher purpose of embodying these values through the love of God and understanding His divine plan. Without this grounding, nothing would prevent us from descending into a life of callous exploitation and cynical self-centeredness. However, biology shows us that this isn't entirely true. The thought that even the most atheistic biologists advocate callous amorality is absurd. Suggesting that the brain may be a physical system made of ordinary matter does not strip it of its morality. It just offers a different explanation to the origins of the brain's morality, as can be illustrated in this Calvin and Hobbes comic strip. In the comic strip, Calvin confidently announces to Hobbes that he doesn't believe in ethics anymore. As far as he's concerned, the ends justify the means. He further justifies his stance by claiming they live in a dog-eat-dog world. Calvin insists he'll do whatever he wants to achieve his desires, leaving the moral quandary of right and wrong to others. In response to this, Hobbes pushes Calvin into a puddle of mud in front of them in order to make way for himself to pass. Calvin, now furious, demands to know why Hobbes pushed him. Hobbes smugly retorts with the same reasoning Calvin used just moments earlier: the ends justified the means. What Hobbes humorously teaches Calvin and the reader of this comic strip is the basic logic as to why morality exists, or at the very least, a reasonable theory of why it exists. The feline Hobbes shows why an amoral egoist is an untenable position in society. He is better off if he never gets shoved into the mud, but he can hardly demand that others refrain from shoving him if he himself is not willing to forgo shoving others. And since one is better off not shoving and not getting shoved than shoving and getting shoved, it pays to insist on a moral code, even if the price is reluctantly adhering to it oneself. In other words, even though Calvin may see nothing wrong in the cruel act of pushing people into mud, Hobbes tries to teach him to curb this bad habit because he, in turn, receives the guarantee that others won't do the same to him. Some people may deduce that this proves the idea of the blank slate, that this is something that is learnt from society. But the fact that children as young as a year and a half spontaneously give toys, proffer help, and try to comfort adults or other children who are visibly distressed tells a different story. People in all cultures distinguish right from wrong, have a sense of fairness, help one another, impose rights and obligations, and believe that wrongs should be redressed. These are all things that we may take for granted and not regard as evidence for the innate mind, but that become glaringly obvious by their absence in the aberrant individuals we call psychopaths. In addition, just as we discussed when debunking the fear of inequality, the notion that some ideas are inherently noble while others aren't is fallacious. Science may have inspired movements like eugenics, but it also led to the creation of medicines that saved millions. In the same light, religion may have provided moral guidance to many over centuries, but we cannot ignore the people who have committed atrocities in its name. The massacre of Midianites and abduction of their women, the stoning of prostitutes, the execution of homosexuals, the burning of witches, the slaying of heretics and infidels, the throwing of Protestants out of windows, the withholding of medicine from dying children, the shooting up of abortion clinics, and the crashing of airplanes into skyscrapers. The recurrence of evil acts committed in the name of God shows that they are not random perversions. An omnipotent authority that no one can see is a useful backer for malevolent leaders hoping to enlist holy warriors. And since unverifiable beliefs have to be passed along from parents and peers rather than discovered in the world, they differ from group to group and become divisive identity badges. Thus far, I have argued against the fear of nihilism from a religious standpoint. However, this fear also lurks among the secular, arising when biology seems to deflate the values we most cherish. If the reason we love our children is merely that a squirt of oxytocin in the brain compels us to protect our genetic investment, wouldn't the nobility of parenthood be undermined and its sacrifices devalued? If sympathy, trust, and a yearning for justice evolved as a way to earn favors and deter cheaters, wouldn't that imply that there are really no such things as altruism and justice for their own sake? We sneer at the philanthropist who profits from his donation because of the tax savings, the televangelist who thunders against sin but visits prostitutes, the politician who defends the downtrodden only when the cameras are rolling, and the sensitive new age guy who backs feminism because it's a good way to attract women. Evolutionary psychology seems to be saying that we are all such hypocrites all the time. This fear can easily be dispelled by the understanding of proximate causes and ultimate causes. To explain these causes, we could use the opening scene in Annie Hall, in which the young Alvy Singer has been taken to the family doctor. In the scene, Alvy's mother explains to the family doctor that Alvy is depressed. Alvy then continues to explain to the doctor that the reason for his depression is that he read somewhere that the universe is expanding, which means that someday it could break apart, and that would mean the end of everything. To this explanation, the mother then asks Alvy, "What is that your business?" and explains to the doctor that Alvy stopped doing his homework, to which Alvy replies, "What's the point?" The scene is funny because Alvy has confused two levels of analysis: the scale of billions of years with which we measure the universe, and the scale of decades, years, and days with which we measure our lives. As Alvy's mother correctly points out, what has the universe got to do with it? You're here in Brooklyn. Brooklyn is not expanding. People who are depressed at the thought that all our motives are selfish are as confused as algae. They have mixed up ultimate causation, why something evolved by natural selection, with proximate causation, how the entity works here and now. The mix-up is natural because the two explanations can look so much alike. Our genes may have selfish motives, but interestingly enough, sometimes the most selfish thing a gene can do is wire unselfish motives into a human brain, heartfelt, unstinting, deep in the marrow unselfishness. The love of children, who carry one's genes into posterity, a faithful spouse, whose genetic fate is identical to one's own, and friends and allies, who trust you if you're trustworthy, can be bottomless and unimpeachable as far as we humans are concerned on a proximate level, even if it is metaphorically self-serving as far as the genes are concerned on an ultimate level. In other words, it is a bad idea to say that our motives are meaningful in a personal sense only because they are inexplicable in a greater biological sense. In conclusion, the exploration of space, the mysteries of the brain, and the resistance to accepting a lack of free will illuminate a profound truth about human nature. Our quest to understand ourselves is as vast and complex as the universe itself. From the grandeur of cosmic structures to the intricacies of our neurological makeup, we are constantly confronted with the limits of our knowledge and the discomfort of challenging long-held beliefs. Yet, it is in this discomfort that we find the potential for growth. Just as Galileo's revolutionary ideas reshaped our understanding of the cosmos despite fierce opposition, modern science challenges us to reconsider our notions of identity, morality, and consciousness. The resistance to these ideas, whether from religious or secular perspectives, underscores a deeper fear of losing a sense of purpose and moral grounding. However, acknowledging the mechanistic nature of our brains does not strip life of meaning. Rather, it offers a new lens through which to view our shared humanity. By embracing the evidence of our innate mind and the complexities of our existence, we can foster a more nuanced understanding of what it means to be human, balancing the knowledge of our biological constraints with the pursuit of ethical and compassionate living.